There is a photograph taken in 1933 that the entire world thinks it understands. A young woman leans against a car with a revolver on her hip and a cigar between her teeth. She looks dangerous. She looks free. She looks like someone who chose that life without apology. That photograph launched one of the most successful lies in American history. And the lie was not just that she smoked cigars. The lie was everything. The lie was the romance. The lie was the rebellion. The lie was the idea that Bonnie Parker and Clyde Barrow were anything other than two desperate, broken young people who left a trail of dead bodies across 5 states and died with less than $60 between them. What I am about to tell you is not the movie. It is not the legend. It is the documented record, and it is far more disturbing than anything Hollywood ever put on screen. Clyde Barrow was born into poverty in Ellis County, Texas, in 1909. His family was so poor that for a period during his childhood, they lived under a wagon on the side of a road because they had no house. That is not a metaphor. That is where they actually slept. By the time he was 16, he was already stealing cars. By the time he was 20, he had been arrested multiple times for theft, breaking and entering, and assault. But what turned Clyde Barrow from a small-time thief into something more dangerous happened inside the walls of the Eastham Prison Farm between 1930 and 1932. An older inmate named Ed Crowder repeatedly abused him. Clyde's response was to kill him with an iron pipe. What came out of Eastham was not the same person who went in. Criminal psychologists who reviewed his case decades later identified patterns consistent with severe antisocial personality disorder. That is not a prison story. That is a violent story. And it started long before Bonnie Parker ever existed in his life. Bonnie was 19 when they met in January of 1930 at a friend's house in West Dallas. She was already legally married to Roy Thornton, a small-time criminal who was serving time in prison. She never divorced him. On the morning they were both killed in Louisiana in 1934, she was still wearing Roy's wedding ring. Think about that image carefully, because it dismantles the entire foundation of the love story you were sold. The woman who was turned into the symbol of passionate, defiant romance spent every day of her life with Clyde running from police while wearing another man's ring. Police recovered letters and notebooks from hideouts they had abandoned. Those letters showed a relationship filled with arguments, separations, and moments where Bonnie seriously considered turning herself in. Clyde's own sister later said in interviews that the relationship was nothing close to what the film showed. It was held together by fear, dependency, and the simple fact that once you are that far in, there is no clean way out. The image of them as Robin Hood figures, robbing the rich to feed the poor, has no single piece of evidence to support it. Not one police record, not one bank report, not one testimony from any resident in any of the 12 towns where they regularly operated shows any act of generosity. What they actually robbed were gas stations, roadside grocery stores, and small rural banks in the middle of communities where everyone was already struggling. The average haul from a robbery barely covered gas and food. When Dallas police questioned relatives of the pair in 1934, the answer to whether they had money was blunt. They barely had enough to keep moving. The Robin Hood story was built in newsrooms by editors who understood that a romantic outlaw couple sold more papers than the truth. In 1930s America, with a quarter of the population out of work and families sleeping in cars, readers wanted heroes who fought back. The newspapers gave them characters instead of criminals. That decision echoed for 90 years. Now here is the number that the movies always buried. 13 people confirmed dead. 9 of them were police officers. But these were not federal agents with salaries and pensions and government protection. These were county sheriffs and small-town patrolmen making between $40 and $80 a month. men with pregnant wives at home, men with children who waited by the window at night. Malcolm Davis, H.D. Murphy, E.B. Wheeler. None of them became movie characters. None of them got a memorial or a ceremony. Their families survived the Depression with nothing because there were no law enforcement pensions in rural Texas in 1934. The state gave them a death certificate and moved on. Hollywood gave Bonnie and Clyde a film score and Warren Beatty. The gap between how those stories were treated is not an accident. It is a deliberate choice about who gets to be remembered as human. Bonnie never fired a weapon at anyone. Every crime scene report and every surviving witness account confirms this. She drove, she kept watch, she passed weapons when needed, and she was present for robberies and murders. That made her legally guilty of all of it, and the justice system knew it. But the specific image of her shooting alongside Clyde, the way the 1967 film depicted her, is fiction constructed for commercial purposes. The reality is that the press had already done most of the work long before any film was made. When police raided an abandoned hideout in Joplin, Missouri in 1933, they found undeveloped rolls of film. When the photographs were printed, they showed Bonnie posing with the revolver and the cigar. Clyde had taken those pictures as a private joke between them. Bonnie did not smoke cigars. She wrote in a letter to her mother that she was humiliated by those photos and terrified of being remembered that way. She was right to be terrified, because that image traveled across the country in 48 hours and became the definitive version of who she was. A joke became a legend. An embarrassing photograph became an icon. She died knowing that the world had already decided who she was, and that the truth had no chance of catching up. The actual conditions of their life together have no glamour in them whatsoever. They lived out of stolen cars. They slept in those cars, ate in those cars, hid in those cars for weeks at a time across the back roads of Texas, Oklahoma, Missouri, Arkansas, and Louisiana. Clyde walked with a permanent limp because of a foot injury that never healed properly. In 1933, the car Clyde was driving went off a bridge in Texas and caught fire with Bonnie inside. The burns on her leg became severely infected. She was in constant pain for the remaining year of her life. When officers opened the Ford V8 on that Louisiana road on May 23, 1934, everything Bonnie and Clyde owned in the world was on that seat. 6 guns, a broken guitar, and $57. That was the entire net worth of the 2 most wanted criminals in America. There was no ranch waiting for them. There was no plan. There was no exit. There was just the next road and the hope that today would not be the last one. That last day came because of betrayal, not because of police work. Henry Methvin, a member of their own gang who had joined when he was barely out of his teens, made a deal with retired Texas Ranger Frank Hamer, and the terms were simple. Methvin would give up their location, and his father Iverson would avoid prosecution. Hamer had spent 102 days tracking every movement, every pattern, every contact the pair had. On the morning of the ambush, 6 officers lay hidden in the brush along a rural road in Bienville Parish, Louisiana, near the Methvin family property. When the gray Ford V8 slowed down after spotting Iverson's truck parked on the shoulder, the officers opened fire without any warning, without any call to surrender. Approximately 130 rounds were fired in under 10 seconds. Clyde was barefoot. Bonnie was holding a sandwich. She was 23 years old. Frank Hamer never received a medal. He never received a ceremony or a formal acknowledgement from the state of Texas. And the legal question of whether the ambush constituted a lawful use of force kept the government at a distance from any public celebration of what he had done. He died in 1955. The state of Texas did not formally recognize his work until 2019, 65 years after the fact. when the 1967 film portrayed him as a cowardly villain chasing two beautiful lovers across the countryside. His widow filed a lawsuit against Warner Brothers. She lost. But letters from Hamer himself, which surfaced during the case, described Bonnie and Clyde in terms that no one in Hollywood ever used. He called them lost young people with no real exit and no real plan. The man who knew their habits better than anyone alive saw nothing in that story worth romanticizing. The 1967 film did not become a hit because it was historically accurate, and it became a hit because of timing. The studio almost shelved it. When it opened, the major critics dismissed it as exploitative and too violent. Then something shifted. It was 1967. Vietnam was on television every night. Students were being tear-gassed in the streets. The counterculture had no interest in clean heroes or institutions that deserved respect. And suddenly, here was a film where two young people from nowhere drove fast, broke rules, and died refusing to surrender to the system. That generation did not adopt the film because of the history. They adopted it because it felt like a mirror. Time magazine reversed its negative review and put the film on its cover. Warner re-released it and made back everything they had almost written off. The romantic outlaw legend was not born from truth. It was born from a generation's anger at a government they no longer trusted, projected backward onto two people who would have recognized none of it. Weeks before she died, Bonnie wrote a poem called The Story of Bonnie and Clyde and sent it to the newspapers. The final lines described exactly what eventually happened to them: an ambush on a road, no warning, no escape. She wrote it at 23. Police had previously seized other notebooks filled with her work. Teachers who knew her said she had been a genuinely talented student before she left school. She could write, and the poetry she wrote from inside that life was not romantic. It was the writing of someone who had looked at the end clearly, decided she could not change the direction, and chose to document it instead. Some historians who studied those texts believe she had moved past any hope of being saved. That poem was not a call for help. It was a record she left behind while she was still alive to write it. She knew the road she was on, knew where it ended, and kept driving. Bonnie Parker's mother, Emma, gave interviews in the 1950s that bore no resemblance to any version Hollywood produced. She did not talk about love defying the odds. She talked about a daughter who was taken. Emma said that Bonnie tried to leave Clyde at least twice, and that in one of those moments she was close to turning herself in when Clyde found her and forced her to leave with him. To Emma, the story was not about two rebels against the world. It was about a mother who lost her daughter to a violent man, one argument and one road at a time, and the Barrow family disputed that account. They said Bonnie stayed because she wanted to, that nobody was forced into anything. The two families agreed on almost nothing. But not a single person on either side, not one relative, not one childhood friend, not one person who actually knew them, ever used the word romance to describe what they witnessed. That word belonged entirely to the people who never met them. Here is what was actually found in that Louisiana car after the shooting stopped: a broken guitar, 6 firearms, $57 in cash, a bologna sandwich on the floor, some clothes, a few notebooks. That was the complete inventory of 2 lives lived entirely outside any system of permanence or safety. No home, no savings, no future, no plan beyond the next tank of gas. The Great Depression explains how people like Bonnie and Clyde came to exist. It does not change the 13 funerals that followed them. It does not fill the bank accounts of the police widows who raised children alone. It does not erase the 26-year-old patrolman whose wife was pregnant when he was shot doing his job for $60 a month. The tragedy of Bonnie and Clyde is not that they died young on a Louisiana road. The tragedy is that the people they left behind never got a film, never got a poster, never got a story that the whole world retold for 90 years. They got silence. And the myth got everything else.